There is a power loose in the earth, ancient and forever new. No one may resist. It is the very ray which gives discovery. No one will stop or manipulate it. The ray of discovery will change your world. Hello again, and thank you for tuning in. In our continuing series of telecasts, we will chronicle some of the most astounding discoveries made in our time. You and I together will rediscover technology kept suppressed for some 50 years by desperate financiers. Look to your viewing screens now as we unfold this drama together.
It was to be during this nation's golden era of discovery and invention that some of the most astounding facts concerning our world were determined. These truths were had through truly gifted persons, many of whose very lives were later to become nightmares of futility and heartache. And this was so because of another truly American invention. We will continue to expose and condemn this of which we speak. This began with America's Commodores, who realized that the control and suppression of discovery itself would be the next utmost necessity for maintaining their status quo of greed, domination, and dynastic control worldwide, with America as their safe haven of operation. To achieve these ends, these persons had developed systems of acquisition and subsequent selective destruction, and are criminals of the lowest order, whose crimes against humanity must not go unpunished. We open to you now a lost chapter in what should be common knowledge to all, and the medical arts of which we speak continue to stand the test of time, albeit cherished by a stronghold of adherents. It is with these things in mind that we present several video essays now on radionic medicine. The 1870s was the setting of so many strange and wonderful discoveries, most of which remaining relatively unknown to the masses. These discoveries dealt with phenomena which extended the etheric view of the natural world and represent the definitive proofs which strike at relativity theory and inert physics. Several of these great discoveries dealt with the human organism and its relationship to the external dynamics which dominate our existence. Dr. George S. White, a medical doctor having a brilliant record of academic achievements and bearing degrees from several academic institutions here and in England, began to make several serious inquiries into the role of the human organism within the magneto-electrical environment in which we live. In a rare and seemingly unrelated series of observations, Dr. White discovered that certain senses would vary in their degrees of intensity depending upon one's own position relative to north. He was able to differentiate different qualities of sound in pitch and intensity while facing various compass directions. These were carefully noted as peculiarities of the human organism. Dr. White then made careful analysis of these effects when the body was not grounded directly. He found that the intensity of audible sound did slightly diminish. When a person was grounded properly, Dr. White found that the sense of hearing was slightly greater. These subtle but noticeable effects upon the human organism of both the magnetic and the electrical energies of Earth seems to speak of deeper possibilities. Dr. White made a series of non-biased experiments with certain patients of his who had terrible difficulty sleeping. Dr. White oriented these patients' beds along magnetic meridians, and he grounded the bedsteads with copper wires. The effects of these slight adjustments resulted in his patient's ability to sleep deeply, easily, and without the aids of opiates, which they had been given by other physicians. Here, then, were the beginnings of an understanding of the natural energies of both the environment and the human organism, which would forever alter the basic notions of diagnosis and treatment. Dr. White made careful study of these energies and dared to mention that the energy of the human organism was associated with electricity, but seemed to behave with different modes of reaction. It was to be the work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich in the 1940s who would define the rules and the behavior of orgone energy, to which Dr. White had been referring. Dr. White made careful study of the effects of radio wave transmission upon animals and upon humans. And he discovered that whenever certain forms of waves were being broadcast, that a state of tension would result within the organisms without the sound actually being heard. With this came the gradual realization that the nerve, muscles, and organs of the body were in fact capable of directly indicating external influences which were not normally noticed. These energies seemed to be directly bypassing the sense organs themselves and affecting the organs. Muscle contraction was thereafter to be the central focus in Dr. White's brilliant series of discoveries in the field of radio diagnosis. We continue to invite and challenge you, the audience, to reproduce these effects for yourselves, and we also welcome all correspondence very gladly. A change of tension takes place whenever one faces along an east-west line or along a north-south line. For these measurements to be properly made, one must be well grounded, and all such observations must be made in a darkened room. Dr. White discovered that these muscle tensions were not normally noticeable in lighted conditions because the light beams seemed to behave as conduction paths, acting to short the nerve energies involved. He also discovered that various color beams would elicit very specific responses in very specific portions of the thoracic cavity. Dr. White began to realize that these specific responses could be matched against a normalizing measurement in order to find a patient's relative degree of health or of illness. In fact, Dr. White began to become very adept at diagnosing certain disease states or health states by this response technique alone. Dr. White gradually came to the realization that such an effect might actually become a powerful diagnostic tool. The sympathetic vagal response, or the SVR as Dr. White termed it, is observed when patient and doctor are facing along an east-west line, with the patient being well grounded by a metallic line. In a darkened room, this symmetry of position produces in the patient varying degrees of muscular tightness or relaxation in the abdominal region. Upon being percussed by the physician performing the diagnosis, definite tonal changes in the abdomen are clearly heard. Dr. White developed this percussion method to a fine degree of accuracy. He was able to use this response in order to diagnose certain ailments. Conditions of the total person could then be ascertained with such a high degree of accuracy, and these methods were employed by him for years in the successful diagnosis of persons brought to him having puzzling symptoms. Dr. White developed very interesting and most Victorian percussion devices of all sorts, and took the percussion form of diagnosis to its very limits. Thereafter, Dr. White began to introduce new and strange methods of diagnosis based on these simple, natural observations. Aspects of instrumentation involving purely electrical reflexes and the accurate calibration of reflex energies while linked to diseases was to be perfected in the hands of Dr. Albert Abrams of San Francisco. This was done in the early 1900s. Dr. White linked specific reflexes of these kinds to diseases. He knew that the appearance of a specific reflex degree, as measured on his various forms of meters, would indicate a specific disease with nearly pinpoint accuracy. Electrodiagnosis was born before this century's turn, and this meant for the first time in recorded history that unerring diagnosis of disease conditions could be ascertained with unprecedented accuracy. Dr. George S. White was performing such forms of diagnosis as far back as 1880. Thus, these simple involuntary muscular reflexes, much like the iris in the eye being exposed to light, would reveal the presence or absence of certain diseases. Dr. White hoped that physicians thereafter would simply read out measured values and identify the conditional trace reading in a catalog or atlas of disease or health values. In his hands, these methods soon became powerful diagnostic tools. Along with these realizations came new questions dealing with the true nature of illness and its cure. In summary, we may say that just as when the iris of the eye is exposed to light, contracting involuntarily, so Dr. White came to realize that certain muscular states of tension or relaxation exist whenever the body is exposed to various degrees of health, vitality, or disease. Thus, an ill person would demonstrate certain muscular tension in certain portions of the abdomen. The physician would reveal these by percussing the abdomen directly or by using tonal instruments of the kind which Dr. White was developing. A pitch change or a change in intensity when measured against a normal line would reveal some relative degree of disease or of health. Dr. White then realized that certain muscular tensions in certain portions of the body were definitely associated with specific diseases. He, of course, found that from patient to patient, these muscular strains were constant. Knowing this, it was possible to establish a catalog of disease muscle states. In a darkened room, these muscular strain states were particularly noticeable. When, however, even a pinpoint beam of light was permitted to fall upon the patient's abdomen, certain reflexes would begin to occur. This seemingly magical effect was studied by Dr. White for years. He began realizing that there existed certain stimuli which produced involuntary muscular contractions of this sort. We do not have time to mention his various and sundry experiments dealing with magnetic fields, or electrical fields, or even the effect of the pointed finger at a person's abdomen from several feet away, all of which produced muscular involuntary contractions. This indicated a form of communication between environment and organism which was hitherto unknown. The fact that these particular effects occurred with constancy from patient to patient revealed to Dr. White's mind a method of powerful diagnosis. Yet in its infancy, these basic assumptions and direct observations taken from nature would later prove to become one of medicine's greatest tools in diagnosis. The sad fact, however, is that none of these methods of electro or photodiagnosis are being utilized at all. Dr. White's next brilliant series of experiments dealt with the effects of particular color beams exposed upon the abdomens of certain patients. Dr. White came to realize that certain colors would affect specific involuntary muscle reflexes in patients. The most important aspect of this fact was that specific diseases always would respond to certain colors. The muscle contractions always occurred in the same location. So, Dr. White began standardizing his tests using pure color beams as the stimuli for eliciting his vagal responses. He also discovered a similar, delicate response in the human iris. Thus, along an east-west line, certain color beams would elicit certain contractions or dilations of the human iris, indicating disease or vitality conditions. Various colors would reveal varieties of the responses, indicating the presence or absence of specific disease groupings. He thus began to run his patients through such series of tests. It was with such ease and grace that Dr. White was able, during the 1880s, to make specific clear diagnosis time after time with startling accuracy. Fountains of discoveries began to pour in upon him now, and with each new experimental arrangement, certain new facts were established concerning the human organism and the environment in which we live. The discovery that any human being could alter the vagal response by merely pointing a finger from a distance at a patient more clearly than ever displayed the existence of a mysterious vital energy within living organisms. That this fact was closely allied with electricity did not much matter to Dr. White. He determined that any linear spreading energy could act as a conduction path for these human energy rays, and these effects could occur wirelessly through the space of several feet. What else could this be but some auric energy of high, constantly nourished potential? Such pivotal discoveries would later be advanced by Thomas Hieronymus with his discovery of L-optic energy rays, and Dr. Kilner, whose blacklight glass screens would enable him to directly view the vital emanations from any living object. Dr. Albert Abrams in San Francisco would also develop these reflex diagnosis methods to a higher degree of accuracy. Dr. White was making steady progress now in his methods of diagnosis. He standardized color emulsions, whose light rays would reveal the presence of the common diseases then prevalent. Running through these color rays became routine for Dr. White, and success of diagnosis was his by these techniques alone. These methods are reproducible and await the enterprising. With his discovery of vital organic energy came the sudden realization that illness might have a vibratory nature. If this were so, then cures might be had through specific light ray beams. These were designed to interfere with a disease condition. Dr. White was a believer in the theory of Dr. Virchow, father of the cell theory, which stated that specific germs seem to be attracted to their natural habitat of disease condition and may augment pre-existing conditions of weakness in the body of a patient. While Dr. Abrams in San Francisco was delving into the electrical means of diagnosing disease during the early 1900s, Dr. White continued to use color ray beams in his diagnosis. For Dr. White, beams of colored light were living conduits of power, capable of transducting strange vitalizing energies into the physical bodies of his patients, which in many cases had lost their ability to conduct these nutritive portions of the enlivening environment. To Dr. White, these beams of color were as solid as any transmission line and were in fact the sites of many energetic interactions beyond that of color. He began now to attack the problem of effecting whole body cures for the infirm via light beams as vital conduction path. His discovery of vital energy transfer between persons was made as far back as 1876. In this effect, a patient would cause energy to be passed to a neutral subject. Observing the neutral subject for signs of muscle tension or relaxation would always reveal the disease state of the patient. The character of these muscle responses would vary with the health conditions of the persons involved. He made discoveries which were corroborated later by Dr. Albert Abrams, Ruth Drown, Eamon, Hieronymus, and many others concerning the polarities of the human body. He delved into the natural polarities of solar light and of lunar light. He made a great discovery wherein even a pinpoint ray of lunar light will trigger the vagal response. This was both rare and sublime in demonstrating the delicately wonderful sensitivity of our organisms to the external changes of the most subtle varieties of energy. It was Dr. White's belief that disease states would alter the natural nervous energy of the body, thus rendering the muscles into a state of tension. If color beams could trigger the response themselves, might not this method also cause an interference with the disease state, thus neutralizing it through color alone? His was an attempt to cause vivifying energies to enter the body of an ill person via color beams. For Dr. White, a disease condition in an organism represented dysfunctionate vibration. His was the attempt to re-establish the proper resonance of the body in order to create a healthy condition. This view admitted of certain basic facts. First, that our organisms are absolutely awash in an energetic environment which determines our state of health or of sickness. Second, that disease conditions or vivifying conditions actually enter our bodies from the external. Third, that energies of various kinds focus into and upon certain physical organs. Fourth, that certain disease vibrations actually focus upon portions of the physical body, causing lesions to occur. The site of a disease was termed by him simply as a lesion. The energy of these lesions could be measured by the effect upon the vagal muscular response under certain light rays. Even hidden lesions could then accurately be monitored by locating these points within the body, which would cause the vagal muscular response variations. Dr. White designed probes which would be passed over the body in making these determinations. Thus, progress in achieving health could be monitored as well. In a series of experiments involving the transfer of vital energy, Dr. White would use two persons. One would be a patient suffering a specific illness. This person would be seated with an attached electrode to the sternum. The neutral subject would then grasp the other terminal of this conduction line. When the physician examined this person, it was found that they would elicit the very response of the patient's disease condition when diagnosed. Here, said Dr. White, was proof that diseases both could emanate energies and could generate similar conditions in others by mere association. These occurred without germ transfer and were immediate in their effects and removal. For when the subject released the conduction line to the unhealthy patient, the vagal response became normal immediately. This simply profound demonstration may be repeated and demonstrated clearly. It proves the vibratory theory of disease transmission by conduction paths alone. That persons may experience symptom transfers became a common demonstration for Dr. White to repeatedly prove throughout his career. We may add that in our next video essay concerning the life and work of Dr. Albert Abrams, it was possible to prove that a muscle contraction of involuntary nature occurs whenever persons are exposed to pathogenic cultures. Dr. White's final developments dealt with finding the means of reversing any existent vibratory condition of illness within the human organism. He stated these basic notions in his text, which we have in our possession. One of his statements dealt with the notion that normalizing any abnormal emanation from the body will reverse the condition to a certain degree. He believed that focusing such energies of reversal upon the vagal system would do the greatest good to the patient. His specific discovery in the realm of therapy dealt with using vibrating light beams, which he found to have the most beneficially stimulating quality. These the body could assimilate readily. Others have measured the effects of such vibrating light beams through the body. Vibrating energies conducted through the physical organism may play its greatest role in continuing the vitality of any person. Dr. White stood firmly against the use of radium or X-ray as a treatment for lesions of any kind. He was one of the first to state that most of the treatments of lesions in these methods resulted in severe malignancies. For him, such energies were alien to the human organism, resulting in dysvibratory conditions. During the early 1900s, Dr. George S. White made steady progress in developing lamps of various kinds for therapy. In 1915, he gave a lecture series across the nation to other physicians. Dr. George S. White was a fortunate man. He lived a good, long, and healthy life, unencumbered by the criminal elements whose works destroy discovery. He was the exception to the rule, and it is with joy that we look upon this wonderful physician whose very smile radiates vitality and verve and gives a word of encouragement to us all. We salute your humor and your twinkling smile, Dr. George Star White, indeed. We have seen in our previous telecast the early developments of Dr. George S. White in his researches of organic energies, natural environmental energies, and the role of both in novel means of diagnostic medicine. During the time in which Dr. White was advancing his earliest theories, it was also Dr. Albert Abrams of San Francisco who had begun to make further advances in a different but related branch of study. Having become familiar with the work of Dr. White, Dr. Abrams began searching deeper for new and varied organic reflexes of the involuntary kind. You will remember that it was Dr. George S. White who was pivotal in discovering that the human body actually exhibits states of strain and relaxation, which is measurable whenever a specific state of health or of illness is prevalent. It was Dr. White who advanced the method of diagnosis using such reflexes. And it was Dr. White who also successfully utilized these reflexes in conjunction with beams of strongly colored light in order to test for specific diseases. Dr. Albert Abrams was another highly qualified medical doctor holding multiple degrees and honors from Vienna, Paris, London, and Heidelberg. His discoveries were made in strict scientific honesty, and his life was lived in the purity of devotion to his patients and to his profession and art. Dr. Abrams was very intrigued with the vagal responses and also advanced the methods of Dr. White in transferring organic symptoms from unhealthy patients to neutral test subjects. Shown here, Dr. Abrams had perfected the means by which such energies of unhealth were made to traverse a metallic conductor and cause an involuntary reflex in the abdominal area of a test subject. With these researches, Dr. Abrams was able soon also to make absolute diagnostic determinations of a patient's state of health. In Dr. Abrams' method of diagnosis, the test subject faces towards the west. The position of the patient is immaterial. The subject must be earth-grounded through metal plates and wires. And this duplication of Dr. White's work was exact. Dr. Abrams also found that exposure of the subject to intense light must be avoided. Dr. Abrams was the first to insist that all measurements of these reflexes be made using recording instruments of various kinds. These included various graphic indicators, galvanometers, and several pressure indicators. These were used in objective determinations of the reflexing actions observed whenever a disease condition was present nearby a healthy test subject. Every organism responds more or less intensely to the presence or absence of vital energy. These researchers had discovered that diseases do possess an energy emanation or geometry which is specific for each disease and which causes identical degrees and forms of reflexes involuntarily within the physical body. Measurements and calibrations of these effects do yield absolute diagnostic determinations. Dr. Abrams discovered that this energy was closely allied with electricity, even as Dr. White had earlier declared. Yet this energy was definitely not electricity itself, for it possessed other puzzling qualities closely associated with the energy forms discovered by Baron Karl von Reichenbach in the 1860s. Baron von Reichenbach had named this energy odylic energy, or simply odic energy. And these forms could make themselves known to researchers in pitch-black rooms by their mild fluorescence. Thus, objects of all kinds, whether living or non-living, were transducers of this odylic energy. It was in the University of Heidelberg that Dr. Abrams studied extensively under Professor de Sower, who lectured on the concept of the radiational nature of disease. All of Dr. Abrams' work was later aimed at verifying all these ideas. Dr. Abrams found that he could charge electrical condensers with these energies. He discovered that these energies were similar to odylic energy in that their velocity of propagation along metallic transmission lines was very slow, about 1 or 2 meters per second. He discovered that pathological energies could not pass through insulators. Dr. Abrams discovered the varied effects to be noted whenever magnets and electrical conductors were caused to point directly into specific portions of the spinal column. These effects included drastic alterations of the heart rate and the dulling of the reflex reactions of all the involuntary kinds. His textbooks are of an extraordinary nature, and for their sheer richness, depth, and wealth of information are a phenomenon in themselves. Dr. Abrams made a thorough search in the various effects of energies upon organic energy. These were later to prove invaluable to others, such as Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who measured, collected, and focused this organic energy to perform amazing effects within the natural environment. Dr. Abrams found, for example, that whenever we view a pure red light, that our entire systems become relatively dulled, while the reflex reactions used in diagnosis are enhanced. He discovered that the energies evoked during strong emotional outbursts could actually effect measurable reflexes of the involuntary kind across several meters of free space. He found to his own amazement that pathogenic energy could be stored within an electrical capacitor for several hours up to a day's worth of time. when once this same energy was made to enter the abdominal area of a test subject, the reflex would be the specific one for that original disease source. Now, this was not electrical energy at all, although it possessed certain of the qualities of electrical waves in analogous form. He discovered that aluminum wires could reinforce these energies in a mildly amplified manner. He studied and mapped with great thoroughness the organic energies of the whole body and proved that specific zones and centers of organic potentials exist all throughout. He was able to show that extra-physical energies could be measured with sharply pointed wires, and was able to map out the human aura with certain definitions. These were also corroborated by Dr. Walter Kilner of London, who, with his own black light screens, was able to directly view these auric fields. Dr. Abrams made detailed studies of the energies of thought and its ability to trigger involuntary, measurable reflexes across free space. He noted the relative differences between the sexes and noticed the opposite organic polarities of male and female subjects. He found it possible to transfer organic energies within a person's own body by connecting centers of these energies, and was able to measure relative disease states through his reflex reaction series within the person's confines. It soon became apparent to Dr. Abrams that the use of a neutral living subject might be made unnecessary through the use of strictly electrical measurements of reflex energies. Thus it was Dr. Abrams' great movement toward objective measurement which enabled the physician to make direct calibration and determination of a patient's state of health with electrical meters of specific design. This was progress in externalizing the intuitively known things. This was the major breakthrough of Dr. Albert Abrams, and was to launch him along a free path of ever-accelerating discovery, design, and development of new and unknown electrodiagnostic appliances. His early use of pressure meters and hydraulic amplifiers had proved their effectiveness well enough at the time of their appearance. But it was through the use of electrical signal measurements alone that Dr. Abrams realized a yet higher degree of precision and an ease of diagnosis that hitherto was unknown to the field. These developments were to virtually explode into an entirely new realm of medical arts, accompanied by hundreds of advancements by others in later years. Their resultant discoveries and the utilization of those discoveries was to be suppressed as witchcraft by the medical association's contrivance of an inquisition. This was all smokescreen works of the Commodore rule, whose only aim is the elimination of other future enterprises from the marketplace in order to secure dynastic rule and power. Rarely is it the case that the information of discovery is to be secretly hoarded for personal gain or use in time of need. Although we have evidence that certain of these commodores have done so, particularly in the medical fields. Their numerous secretive visits to Swiss resorts and certain subsequent extensions of life seem to be extremely suspect. Learning the laws of isolating, amplifying, conducting, and shielding out organic energies, Dr. Abrams began designing better and more compact devices for diagnosis. Some have accused these researches of Dr. Abrams with the supposed onus of mesmerism. But that vicious campaign of European medical practitioners against Anton Mesmer was every bit as shabby as those ventured against these revolutionary researchers here during the early portions of our century. Against the purity of new discovery, these persons launched their slander campaigns. Anton Mesmer, in truth, had discovered these selfsame energies and the basic rules for both conducting and insulating against their passage. His work had nothing to do whatsoever with hypnosis. And yet, it is remarkable how that these smear campaigns have fixed such false notions in our minds as bywords. The baguette of Mesmer was simply an intuitively constructed battery of vitalizing energies, which utilized layers of organic matter and iron powder in multiple layers. The effect of this energy upon the various centers of reception in the spine or the abdomen could result in pleasurable fainting spells, whereupon the subject would internalize the surge of power. This baguette of Mesmer was simply a vital energy generator. The resulting restructuring of a patient's energy field could bring about reversals in the unhealthy conditions. The often total cures to be had in Mesmer's spa were spectacularly miraculous and definitely threatening to the others, who then accused him of charlatanry, duplicity, fraud, or even witchcraft. The folklore of every nation is replete with such events occurring at specific places in the mountainsides, and should be the subject of intensive study and pursuit, not of hatred and suppression. We find these latter negative reactions typical of the pathological character prevalent among the academic inner circles, who fear not so much loss of truth as loss of dominion. Dr. Abrams had standardized his reaction series for use, and was actually making equally spectacular pinpoint accurate diagnoses, as was Dr. White earlier. With the aid of his electric meter assembly, he was able to catalog and compile the varieties of reactions from the many patients who came to him in order to best graph his results. The electronic reaction series of Abrams became legendary to those who maintain its use in diagnosis by electrical measurements of involuntary reflexes alone. These catalogs and atlases show the kinds of reflexes and rates of electrical intensities associated with the known disease states of humankind. These are remarkably accurate when properly utilized. Later in the century, Dr. Ruth Drown was to be successful in measuring the energetic potentials and characteristic pulse rates of each individual internal organ, gland, and system. In addition, she was able to mimic the effect of pharmaceuticals by organic energy pulses alone. We will cover the life and work of Dr. Ruth Drown in our next telecast. Dr. Abrams made direct measurements of the electrical conductivity changes in the abdominal region during involuntary reactions of the kind used by him in diagnosing disease states. These reaction rates always indicated a specific condition of health or of disease. With these electrical values, he had made the startling find that our bodies do react automatically and involuntarily whenever exposed to any pathogenic culture. Exposing any person to a specific culture will always evoke the specific value for that disease in the involuntary response series. Soon, Dr. Abrams made a singular discovery which forever spaced him far from the medicine of his time in a permanent manner. While experimenting with his electrical conductivity assemblies, he found that the blood sample of any patient could be made to exhibit all the electrical readings of the patient themselves when conducted into a neutral subject. These last few discoveries made it possible for Dr. Abrams to demonstrate the elimination of the need for the patient's physical presence, the elimination of the need of percussing the patient's abdomen or observing it in the ancient method, and finally, of having the patient present during the diagnosis. The only time Dr. Abrams would use this latter means of determining health was when the patient was unable to travel the long distance to him, or when the patient was too infirm to travel at all. Remember, in those early days of the century, travel was too expensive and limited in aspect for iatrical visits. The only critical value to which Dr. Abrams insisted for these blood sample diagnoses was that the samples reach his laboratory within a certain critical time period. In these aspects, Dr. Abrams believed that the samples of blood taken were acting as storage condensers, even as his former experiments with organic energy persistence was noted. It was Dr. George Kreil who later advanced such theories, and the late Dr. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, who actually studied the role of crystallization in blood samples in the preserving of organic energy within blood itself. The final frontier which Dr. Abrams was to develop had an equal footing with Dr. White's original thesis on disease cause and cure. Seeing the electrical aspects of organic disease energy in the laboratory and realizing its true representation as a carrier energy of organic potentials, Dr. Abrams decided to perform experiments with the introduction of electrical sharp pulses into a patient's body. What he had in mind was the eventual design and proliferation of therapy modes which used electrical waves rather than the material crystals administered as pills to be swallowed or as liquids to be injected. To these ends, he began the experiment using spark gap oscillators of the kind then in use for diathermy. These devices, originally designed by Nikola Tesla, were effective in alleviating certain conditions and ailments. Dr. Abrams suddenly knew why. As Dr. White had indicated, the disease state is characterized by potentials and pulsations which are abnormal for the body as compared with the reactions and values obtained from vital subjects. Against these normal lines, one found that the disease states of various illnesses had constantly manifested values, which were the fingerprints, so to speak, of the illness. Though used in diagnosis, Dr. Abrams wished to now extend these understandings. These new devices were now designed to oppose the disease pulsation states in the attempt at neutralizing and reversing the conditions within the unhealthy patient. These oscillators of Abrams came into great vogue for a time, and Dr. Abrams was able to bring forth the proofs of their efficacy to the public repeatedly. Numerously prestigious and highly qualified writers, possessed of great integrity, visited his now famous clinic in San Francisco, where they saw patients which had been cured of many then incurable ailments. This was so by the application of pulsed electrical energies sent into the affected regions of the body. Thomas Colson was to advance such methods of using chopped pulsations of very energetic electrical waves in order to break disease conditions up within patients. Between 1919 and 1920, at least 50 variations of the Abrams oscilloclast were developed. In America, perhaps, in all this modern world of intrigue, success is a curious thing, having fickle emotions for the discoverer. The one thing which Dr. Abrams never conceived was the cumulative effect of jealousy on the part of numerous of his own colleagues, and the ever-watchful eyes of the dynastic families who can level destructive forces of slander and of maligning epitaphs over the bodies of the innocent whom they step upon in their relentless path of death. The great display of vehemence with which that newly formed association of medical practitioners, an inner council of connected individuals with questionable motives, these pursued and destroyed Dr. Albert Abrams. It is the very irrepressible nature of discovery, however, which causes all dynastic rule to secretly tremble in fear. for no one may tell where or when the next such revolution may arise. Who beyond this nation's borders will appear bearing the prize of truth? Through certain means of character assassination, Dr. Abrams is to this day slandered, ridiculed, and portrayed as a cheap trickster and a sinister figure of whom children should beware. And these portraits are to be found in numerous children's books on doctors and medicine. Such an open exhibition of behavior modification shows the shameless and truly unenlightened attitude of a profession which had once demanded absolute devotion and respect. Through such displays, and measured against these uncovered materials which we are exposing finally to you, we may determine the true motives of the association and discover the true leadership behind the Iron Mask. To be sure, such outrage will no longer be tolerated. The dynastic rule of Commodores must be totally judged and destroyed for its crimes against humanity. In our next telecast, we will tell the life and work of Dr. Ruth Drown, a brilliant and revolutionary worker in the field of medical diagnosis and therapy, of the kind advanced by Dr. Albert Abrams. Dr. Abrams was censured, libeled, slandered in character assaults, viciously pursued. His practice was taken from him, his licenses were taken from him. But for the present, let us salute Dr. Albert Abrams, discoverer, physician, and medical engineer of the future. Groundbreaking and astounding discoveries and developments of Dr. George S. White and Dr. Albert Abrams, working independently at the turn of the century and mentioned by us in 2 previous telecasts, came new discoveries one upon another in the field of radio diagnosis. The cumulative effect of these spectacular findings was to culminate in the life of Dr. Ruth Drown, for whom this video essay is dedicated and for whom the title, Gateway into the Future, is most fitting. While the focus of Dr. White was to be the patient, and that of Dr. Abrams, the neutral subject used in measurement of disease states, it was Dr. Ruth Drown whose revolutionary leap in the art of radiodiagnosis placed physician in focus and responsibility during measurement. Her legacy is remarkable in every aspect. Her designs and research developments are thoroughly spectacular and awe-inspiring, and those who are still alive who remember that sense of the future while in her presence will attest to the truths of which we are now to speak. For discovery is divinely appointed, and no one may long resist the piercing ray. Truth ignored becomes strengthened. Ruth Drown was born in 1892. Both her parents came from families which predated the American Revolution. Her exceptional gifts of intuition led her into an intense love of radio design, then new and in its infancy. Her numerous home constructions always operated perfectly, and with the minimum number of working parts, a marvel of which her later associates would always make comment. delving into the etheric implications of radio waves and the sundry pleasures associated with all such study became her full-time passion. Ruth Drown attended a lecture in Los Angeles by Dr. Frederick Finch Strong, a doctor of medicine and a researcher into the new and revolutionary applications of radiodiagnosis. Himself a Cornell graduate, student of several European institutes, including the University of Berlin, a former professor of bacteriology at Boston University Medical School, Dr. Strong's lecture greatly stirred Ruth Drown to more serious considerations. This adventure was soon to open the very gates of the future of medical therapies and diagnosis, hitherto unknown to mankind. Dr. Strong had been using the diagnostic methods of Dr. Albert Abrams, whose biography and work we summarized in our last telecast. Ruth Drown began study among those students of Dr. Strong whose training involved every aspect of the Abrams diagnostic methodology. Thereafter, attending the Osteopathic College in Kirksville, Missouri, and the Chiropractic College in Los Angeles, she possessed adequate technical training and recognized qualifications for practice. All during her student years and later in her own practice, Dr. Drown was very aware of and sensitive to organic energy surges and the role these played both in maintaining health or in the depression of them during illness. Hers was the desire to directly operate within these realms of energy. Institutional sciences do not accept the presence of or existence of organic energies and seem childishly intent upon reducing all energies into the electromagnetics which centralizes their religion. There are those who had long realized and proven experimentally that electrical manifestations were but the effects of deeper and unknown potentials having nothing to do with electricity at all. We are able to provide documentations of all these assertions for you gladly upon request. Dr. Drown began to study the works of Dr. Abrams with greater depth now. Intuitively, she felt that all foreign energies should be kept out of the body, and in this she diverged from the therapeutic methods of Dr. Abrams. Hers was the quest to isolate and manipulate the organic energies of the body alone. In order to accomplish this, new designs and effects needed to be discovered. Dr. Abrams had discovered that internal lesions could be detected by simply passing certain rods of insulating materials across a diseased site. The resulting sticking sensation was always indicative of the relative intensity and position of the lesion. Without using X-ray, it was possible to triangulate the site of any lesion, there to administer interruptive powers aimed at breaking up the condition. Dr. Earl Smith, a student of Dr. Abrams, was apparently the first to augment these discoveries. Dr. Smith designed a detector of organic energy which would conduct the organic energy from the patient and then make it directly available to the physician performing the diagnosis. The physician now merely needed to stroke his or her fingers over this insulating plate of the device in order to register the response. Such touch responses were the signals indicating the presence of disease. Dr. Drown was on to an amazing path of rediscovery now. By reintegrating and improving the various appliances of detection used in such diagnoses, Dr. Drown was able to introduce new and decisively powerful designs. This is a photograph of the diagnostic tool, which Dr. Ruth Drown designed and perfected in 1929. What we see is the several tuning dials arranged with simple waveguide circuitry beneath the assemblage. It was these which the AMA would ignorantly use in their fierce slandering campaign against Dr. Drown.
To be sure, organic energies possess special modes and laws of conduction and represent a biological form of energy having nothing whatsoever to do with electromagnetics. We see the detection plate, by which the physician makes determinations of tuned settings during the energy scan process. Each of the dials of Dr. Drown's diagnostic instrument were simple resistances arranged in steps of 10. These stepped dials made a diagnosis accurate to the decimal place directly. Hundreds of these Drown diagnostic instruments were designed and utilized throughout the decades. In these instruments, a patient is linked into the circuitry by standing upon a clean metallic plate. The extreme opposite end of this device is simply grounded by wire. The diagnosing physician takes the patient through a series of tuning settings. In this series of tunings, it is the physician who is most responsible. At various settings, as indicated on these diagnostic charts, certain detections will be measured by the physician through the rubbing plate. Whenever a resonant setting is found to yield the sticking reaction, the physician makes careful noting of the dial setting. It is possible not only to scan the varieties of systems within the body by this method, but it is also possible to search through settings representative of every single organ and portions of the physical body. This was so because Dr. Drown had carefully spent years in the preparation of atlases of such values. These were obtained over a very wide and thorough population of individuals who shared common illnesses and common strengths. By such years of thorough investigation and painstaking measurement, Dr. Drown was able to accurately calibrate the rates of organic energies, which were characteristic of each internal organ and systems of organs. Any indication of a signal which would vary from the known normality reading would clearly indicate every internal malady and strength. In fact, it was possible to foretell the appearances of disease far before the ordinary chemical blood tests would even begin to make such indication. These basic laws of organic energy have by no means been exhausted. Perhaps you, the audience, have novel designs along improved lines of thought. We would definitely wish to be so informed. That each object emanates energies, absorbed and altered specifically from the external plenary fullness, is fundamental to these pursuits and discoveries. The radionics movement is global in every aspect, and whether there exist nations who would subvert and suppress such critical and revolutionary knowledge makes no matter. Somewhere, someone is even now delving beyond these early researches and developments, for competition balances the books. In 1929, well before the outrageously fierce campaign leveled against Ruth Drown under the title of, quote, "protecting the public interest," unquote, Dr. Drown had discovered a new and breathtaking effect while using selective tuners and photographic emulsions. This was to be one of her triumphant finds in the extreme study of organic energy. Dr. Drown designed an experiment whose aim it was to produce images of tissue cross-sections. Dr. Abrams and others had experimented with such energies and managed to produce several clearly obvious shadowgraphs with organic energies alone. In Dr. Drown's device, tuned energies from a patient were made to modulate a beam of light briefly. This lamp was made to flash over a photographic emulsion of special quality. To the utter amazement of many serious students of the art, Dr. Drown was able repeatedly to produce photographic scans of the internal organs. These were taken by the organic energy emissions alone. The selectivity of this seeming miracle was secured via diagnostic tuning banks of the kind which she used. Comprehensible only when we suspend our fixed paradigm and skeptical negativity, we show these remarkable shadowgraphs now taken outside the body. Dr. Drown, throughout her career, made thousands of these such shadowgraphs continuously. These were critical in her revolutionary and futural medical wonders. Whenever energies of resonance are revealed through proper devices and visuators, all surfaces of resonance, all surfaces which transduct the external energy, will in fact reveal their outline in said manner. Were it not for the numerous corroborations of radiovision, as Dr. Drown named the process, we might be forced to reject the entire possibility. But many experimenters have succeeded in yielding similar results with similar designs and apparatus. This photograph of the Delaware radio camera performs equally as well, and these wonders merely await those brave few who will deny all institutional approval and the pure quest of truth. We invite all to reproduce these experiments with great confidence of your success. We live in a vast and glorious plenum, where the unforeseen and unexpected is a major element of experience. And these we have hoped down through the untold ages. It was in Dr. Ruth Drown's radiovision device that organic energy was made to traverse a tuned waveguide and made to alter the light of a lamp in order to produce whole shadows of internal organs. The images would crystallize their radiant patterns through the tuned lamp onto special photographic emulsions. These facts defy logic. They suggest the elimination of all the need for scanning processes, synchronous tones, and the complicated electronics of television. And it is most likely probable that Dr. Nikola Tesla had also discovered such effects. It was of these to which he was referring when speaking of the broadcasting of visions directly. In later years of our century, others had made equally remarkable discoveries in the realms of mineral location via diagnostic tuners. We shall devote 2 episodes to radiovision and earth ranging. Dr. Drown also brought to perfection the blood crystal diagnostic method begun by Dr. Albert Abrams. Her use of blood crystals in remote therapy resulted in her critics' railing accusation of fraud and deception. Dr. Drown proved the efficacy of treating a patient's blood crystal with a resultant effect within the patient's body across any great distance. Telediagnosis and teletherapy were only to be used in dire emergencies. With such harmless diagnostic methods and such harmlessly natural shadowgraphics, Dr. Ruth Drown was now readied for her missing design to make itself apparent. Ever working with the natural in mind, Dr. Drown had discovered wonders for diagnosis of any ailment. With these, painful biopsies were eliminated. Exploratory surgery became a needless encumbrance, and the dangers of exposing weakened persons to X-ray pulses for deep body photographics was removed. You will remember that Dr. R. Raymond Rife, whose discovery of the BX cancer virus proved that radiant emissions, which included X-ray and cobalt therapy, would result in the extreme virulent conditions of said viruses. The therapy to be had via Drown diagnostic tuners is mysteriously powerful. Dr. Drown consistently maintained that the organic energies were far more potent than the inert effects of electrical impulses. These fundamentals were for her to soon prove by deliberate means. That opposing paths of identical energy forms will neutralize themselves is well known. But Dr. Drown hoped that these truths would equally apply to organic energies, for these were energies having radically different properties and sometimes unexpected qualities. Should a selectively tuned energy beam be caused to retrace its path while made to do so in an unfazed mode, all initial energy would cease to be observed. Thus, she performed such experiments upon herself and those near her to discover the effects of neutralizing energetic emanations from specific organs and physical locales. Those former patients of Dr. Ruth Drown who have made reports of these internal examinations using tuned energies have all attested to the marvelous sensation of being internally examined by an unknown force. The second critical part of Dr. Drown's experiment was aimed at the specifically vital necessity of neutralization. Would the neutralization of a disease ray emanation from the body actually reverse the physical condition which caused it? Dr. George White believed so and managed results while using pure, strongly colored beams of light. Dr. Abrams proved the viability of his method, but his pathoclast, or disease breaker, conducted minute radioelectric currents of sharply peaked potentials. With these, he had proven results in the cure of many disease states by those methods alone. Dr. J.G. Miller of Ohio had designed and used his radioclast cure instrument and had a proven effectiveness. Scores of these special devices made to amplify organic energies with electronic tube circuits were all very effective in replacing the need for pharmaceuticals in the cure. Thus, it was simply wave emanations which could replace the use of drugs in curing diseases. These truths may be known through private libraries and the literature available in these levels of inquiry. And to the seriously intent seeker, we wish to make these available. The entire organization of pathometry was disbanded under force after its numerous cures were major headline items across the nation. We are sure that such records have now been eliminated through the decades, but we have access to the originals. All these devices, including the marvelous arc ray tubes of Dr. R. Raymond Rife, had thrillingly proven capabilities. But Dr. Drown was not satisfied with the application of foreign energies into the body of her patients. Ever the lover of the natural and the gentle, Dr. Drown discovered that mighty effects were to be had while simply tuning and directing organic energies. While no absolute feeling of such energies were often sensed directly by the patient, often when in serious conditions, the patients would sense the relief of the tuned emissions gradually. Dr. Drown had succeeded in showing us the gates of futural medicine, the tremendous potentialities to be had in manipulating organic energy is the basis of all of Dr. Drown's great achievements. Hers was the gentle and natural approach of one attuned with the plenum itself. She saw and realized, practiced and proved that therapies of all remarkable kinds could be secured through simple tuning and waveguide techniques. Whenever electronic engineers view these devices, they sneer with contempt because of the elegant simplicity of these diagnostic instruments and the lack of any internal power workings. These schematics again show us the devices in their brutally minimal attire. Yet these instruments do function and perform their intended purpose for doctor and patient. Organic energy itself is one of our century's greatest finds. All through the European and natural folklore of past centuries, such energies were observed in their natural settings through the work of several personages of legendary fame. These energies were isolated, secured, and utilized in formal fashion. But these we shall describe with particular detail in our episode on vital energy emission. Dr. Drown traveled to the University of Chicago to demonstrate her designs before the academic chieftains of the now growing pseudo-religion. She made these photographs before major audiences of medical doctors. She traveled extensively abroad in lecture circuits where similar demonstrations proved the infallibility of her claims, her methods, and her designs. She trained many hundreds of others in these methods, and thousands of these devices are safely vest-pocketed even today across the global village. In fact, these diagrams should be taken seriously enough to be reconstructed because they work. In 1949, the University of Chicago thereafter forced Dr. Drown to sign a document stating that she would never mention their involvement with her work ever again. This in spite of proven demonstrations before major audiences of medical doctors at their behest. In typical smear tactic, those whose work represents truth are often represented alongside those whose clear intent is only fraud and deception. And this is how Dr. Drown was represented. For what we can infer, the Commodoric order had been dispatched in order to finalize their contracted monopoly in the medical world and the trillions to be made thereby. The family pivotal in these caprices is well known, and their holdings are numerous in the pharmaceutical Bastille. It is truly cunning how that these commodores place the command, and the American legal system is perverted to carry out their orders. Their curse weighs heavily upon them, and their numerous philanthropies can never purchase their absolutions. Dr. Drown's devices were removed, her libraries and research facilities ransacked. Her name was slandered openly in Life magazine for the children to see and sneer, as the owned media played their games of behavior modification upon the younger generation. The works of charlatans and cheap tricksters was made the new spectacle for the already decadent youth. Dr. Drown then limited her practice, but continued her research work. She now investigated the many avenues of earth ranging with her diagnostic instruments. The specific aim of these was the detection of mineral ores by her diagnostic instruments and through the use of radio vision. A decoy sent to her with a pleading story resulted in Dr. Drown's arrest at the age of 72. Her compassion was strategically made to work against her, and thereafter through federal court order to work against humanity. State agents were on hand for the show, along with radio and television camera crews, all readied for the great event. Shortly after her release from federal prison, this gentle, quiet, and sensitive woman, whose poise and sharp gaze speak only of dignity and honor, Such a one was to suffer a stroke and die. The menacing judge, whose promise to himself was to try this woman and persecute her, gave his truly contemptible performance. The despicable DA, himself several times evicted from medical institutes for hideous scholarship, engineered Dr. Drown's demise. Yet we must honor and uphold the memory of a truly elegant genius, Dr. Ruth Drown, whose eyes beheld the future and whose designs now navigate the way.
The ray of discovery is touching many different places today. It is arcing widely and rapidly in its blazing paths. These paths are never isolated to one region or nation. The fierceness of the greedy will never succeed in quenching its power. The ray of discovery will continue to change our world. Watch for it.